We live in a changing world, and that changing world requires a deep and thorough analysis on diplomatic, security, and international affairs. Today, I have the pleasure to have with us Professor Constantinos Adamides from the University of Nicosia, who is an expert in international relations, security, and strategy. Among others, he's the director of Diplomatic Academy. My name is Dr. Marios Eftimiopoulos, and I'm the CEO of Strategy International, and this is Prime Analysis. Dear Professor Constantinos Adamides, welcome.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. So, we live in a changing landscape. In this landscape, we are called upon to examine things as they go through. In the latest events, we live in a time of recording. We live in the events taking place in Israel and Palestine, with Hamas having attacked Israel. While on the other hand, the Ukrainian-Russian war is growing. It's moving ahead. There's no limitations. As a first thought, what's your intake on the world order of things as they are today?
I think you very correctly noted that it's changing, and I think we're regressing back to how it was a few years ago. So we live in a period that we thought that it was unthinkable, at least in Europe and around Europe. So I think this is the challenge, to relearn how to think geopolitically and how to deal with these changes, because they're quick, they are changing in terms of not only scope but in terms of methods used. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a big challenge for the new generation as well as the old one, and how the states will collaborate so as to cope with these changes.
I know that you have a great experience. We're colleagues at different universities. You are at the University of Nicosia, and you're also the director of Diplomatic Academy, among other things. Why don't you tell us a few things about yourself so the audience can know, your experience, or how you have decided to become a scientist, an academic, a professional. What is the thing that made it so important for you that you've realized that, we've come to this place and this time we're going to examine and analyze, if you want, the events taking shape around us?
I am an academic, and I focus on international relations and security studies more specifically. I also run the Diplomatic Academy, as you noted, where we have the chance to work both with the government and with foreign missions stationed in Cyprus. I also am the director of another institute called the Institute of Studies for Politics and Democracy, which focuses on politics and democracy, as the name suggests.
Okay.
Now, how did it all start? It goes back a long way back to the US, where I did my bachelor's degree, basically, and I didn't know about political science, but I am from Cyprus, so we knew about the conflict. So the conflict, as with almost all Cypriots, is internalized. It's part of who we are. So we're always focused on some forms of the conflict. And one day I simply took a course called Causes of War. That was it. Right. The rest is history. And after that, I just proceeded.
And I presume that part of your work, as we both are and other colleagues are as well, we travel around the world.
Correct.
I know that you've been recently, on a trip in Korea, in Japan. But what makes it more important is that you've seen another part of the world. You said you were in the United States. So just give us, if you want, a comparative approach between the United States, let's say Cyprus, and also Japan.
It's the culture that differs the most, and the size, of course. The United States, as you know, it's huge. It's fast-paced. It's demanding. It has opportunities, but it's not an easy environment to cope. But when you make it, you make it. Cyprus is more easygoing. It has issues that you need to focus on, societal issues that you need to keep in mind constantly. You need to take those things into consideration for your professional activities. Right. Japan, on the other hand, my experience is very limited compared to the US and Cyprus, but what I can say is that the culture is completely different. I went with my family, and we were simply taken aback with how different the culture was, how polite everyone is, how quiet they are, how careful they are not to offend you. All of these things are kind of unknown either in Cyprus or the US. So that's the biggest difference. And of course, Europe, which is somewhere in the middle frequently, which is the area that I travel the most.
You know, up until that moment, I was thinking that, I was thinking to ask you, which I will in a minute, how do you transpire this in a class? I know that it's very academic question, but then again, it's really important, especially for critical development thinking and practicality, application, and more so to give the importance that we live in a globalized world, and slowly getting into our point of discussion. But how important is it for an academic to be, practical, empirical in knowledge, experiential, by traveling, by adding? I mean, that cultural difference, for example, how would you put it inside your class?
I think this is an excellent point you're making. I think it should be mandatory for faculty to travel as much as possible. It's not just the cultural experience, which is, of course, invaluable, but it's also the knowledge that you gain from people who see things from a different angle, from a different perspective. One of the problems that we have in a small place like Cyprus is the limited network, the limited knowledge. Frequently, I say that whatever I had to offer, I offered it, and whatever I had to gain, I gained it from my colleagues in Cyprus. So unless we go out to see the different perspective, the different kind of thinking, the priorities they set, as whether it's security or anything else, the way they approach stressful relations in Japan, for instance, or elsewhere, all of these are lessons that have to be transferred in class to explain to the students, especially if it's an international audience, to understand how when they travel and when they go elsewhere, things are not like they are in their neighborhood or in the city in which they live.
Hence, why we're doing it in English. So the idea of Prime Analysis and of Strategy International is to do things in English, which is a world trade language that people are using. But coming into this subject, you told me before we started recording that in Japan, at least the experience that you had, very few people spoke English.
Yes.
How do you concur with this? I mean, is it because China is nearby? Is it because of that we are in the Far East? But then again, you have the Pacific Ocean, and then you got, the United States on the other side again. So, this is around Earth. So how do you cope with this?
I'm not entirely sure why this is the case, but perhaps it's because Japan is kind of autonomous in a way. It's a big enough market to deal without strangers, without new people coming in. The truth is we didn't see many foreigners, at least that we could recognize. And this was extremely interesting. But what I found even more interesting is that the lack of English did not stop them from being extremely helpful and willing to communicate with you in whatever way they could. And they adopted to this, going a little bit analog in a way, because they literally had cards where they would have kind of frequently asked questions. These will take a few minutes. Another card.
They would show you a card.
Yes, they will show you a card.
Very good.
Even at the airport.
All right.
And in some places they would use, of course, translators like Google Translate, real time and things like that. But it was extremely interesting how they didn't stop trying to help you or to look hospitable simply because they didn't speak the language.
That probably says a lot about R&D, or why software engineering is extremely high level, or their technology levels are so high in that part of the world. So let me just come back to Cyprus, and let's talk about Europe, Eurasia. In a nutshell, what's your intake about, first of all, Ukraine, Russia, but somehow let's try to connect it a bit with Europe. How much influence have we seen from the beginning until now from the Ukraine-Russia war? Then we'll go to other places. I'm going to go southern until we reach Cyprus, and then follow up the rest of the south. What do you think is happening in that area? How long will it take? How bad or damaging is this for us Europeans? The values, the ethics of Europe, or even the bilateral relations between Europe and Russia?
Yeah, well, all these are extremely important questions. Not easy to answer in 2 minutes, of course. But I will revert back to the original point that I made, that we have to rethink how we look at security. If you look at the first form of security strategy of the European Union. It started with the sentence, "We live in a times of peace and prosperity and this and that." And then last year it started with, "We never had such geopolitical tension." And so we can see how in a few years Europe has to shift mentality once again. And I think this is the biggest impact of this war. The second big impact is the need to understand again who is the security provider for Europe. It's a question that we kind of forgot before. So NATO, for instance, comes into play again, but also the self-defense questions, to what extent, and what happens with countries that are not in NATO, and what is the role of the EU as a security provider, not a soft power, but a hard power.
But is Europe a security provider, or is NATO a security provider?
Well, that's
because if NATO, well, we know that NATO is a security provider, but it's over the Atlantic. It's Euro-Atlantic. So you actually said about Europe as a security provider. So the question is, can Europe become a security provider, and if so, how?
Yeah, exactly. This is the question that Europe needs to answer now, because what happens if you have another Trump, for instance, who says, "You know what, America first, you should take care of your own security problems." Before
but
it wasn't.
In fact, we shouldn't we?
Perhaps we should, and I think we're moving towards that direction, but at a slow pace. The European Union is like an aircraft carrier. It takes time to change direction. It's not a speedboat that will change instantaneously the direction, but you're right, we should. And I think we're moving towards that direction with the introduction of PESCO and other agencies. Strategic compass, exactly. But still, when you look, for instance, at the Baltic states, when things develop, where do they look for security? They don't go to Europe, they go to NATO, basically. So we see that the trust of many member states on the hard security aspect is not in Europe, but in NATO. There is, of course, Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon, where theoretically speaking, Europe has to provide help, but it's quite iffy, if you wish, and we're not sure how applicable it is in real cases, as it has only been invoked once after the terrorist attacks in France.
But it's quite interesting. I concur with this, because recently I was in the Baltic states, one of those. I was in Lithuania, and I foresaw also the fact that they were looking at security guarantees and security protectionism and interoperability and capacity building that actually NATO can provide at this point. And although they are very much European and very European oriented, when it comes down to the military aspect of things, then they prefer to adopt or adapt to the standards as NATO standards, whether they're a part of NATO or outside of NATO, because I saw a lot of non-NATO members that, they would think that leveling their standards in defense would be a NATO standard. And I will keep that NATO standard and security provider when it would come down to the case of Cyprus.
Of course.
So let's go back on Ukraine, Russia. What's happening? How deep is this problem? How long do you think it will take? And the story goes on. We have time.
Right.
Please let us know.
Well, prophecies are a very dangerous profession in our fields, as you know. So let's call it forecasting. Yes, I think it's going to be a protracted conflict, albeit it will change forms. So I don't think it will be a full-scale protracted conflict for long, simply because things can get out of hand and escalate to the point that is in no one's interest. Not to mention, of course, the economic repercussions and all of that. But some form of protractedness will exist, especially in the eastern parts of Ukraine. And this will maintain the tension between Russia on one hand, Europe on the other, and the US, of course. But also it will continue to maintain the tension between China and everyone else, not least because at some point other countries will have to take a stance. And I think this is one of the key elements that we have to constantly reevaluate. Where does the rest of the world stand vis-a-vis this conflict? Because frequently we tend to see this conflict as a global conflict, when in reality the rest of the world looks at it as a European or a Western conflict. I was in a conference in Germany a few months ago, and the title of the conference was a closed workshop, not a conference, and the title was Europe and Africa and the War in Ukraine. And I remember the African generals mostly that participated in this workshop. They said, let's get something straight. They said, this is a you problem. This is not an us problem.
Right.
So it's a you problem, you deal with it. If anything, this conflict takes away from the very important problems that we have. So we need to understand that not everybody looks at that conflict the same way we do. When I say we, I mean the West in general.
It's very interesting you say that because, you know, one of the most interesting. I was a keynote speaker in the Sakharov conference, which is a very known, very Baltic, very prestigious. In what way, however, I was called upon to make that exchange of ideas on the cultural side, if you want, between the South and the North of Europe, meaning, you know, Cyprus and Lithuania. I don't know how do we see things, and I started by saying exactly this, that we foresee things quite differently. And it was very interesting that the Africans said that this is a you problem, but the Europeans at that level of Europeans, we were talking about how Russia can be stopped, and at some point, some Russians or some people that are, you know, former Soviet states which may live in Europe, they even spoke about how splitting Russia, or how to. They initially started with containing, and there's some Europeans say, well, we can split it. I mean, obviously, you understand it's 1/8 of the world's land. It's quite a big country. You can't really split it as you might think of it. But those which were not Europeans, they turned in the next panels and they said, listen, this is your problem, not ours. But my only comment to this is, but don't you think that this war between Ukraine and Russia, however Putin called it a special operation, it's an open war, obviously, but that rose the level of competition that always existed during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, both in South America, also Central Asia, but also Africa. So it's not exactly not of their business. Because they reshaped their relations with Russia, right?
They tried to keep them unaffected to the point that this is possible, because when the West forgot about Africa or Latin America, for that matter, or opposed them in some cases, Russia and China, especially China, was there for them. The Russians, especially with Wagner Group, and this remains to be seen how this will change in the future after their leader's death. They actually offered some services that the West did not. So there was always some form of competition, but the West didn't pay enough attention in Africa or Latin America. And now this war simply makes it interesting for us to ask the rest of the world to take our side, the way we see things.
Right.
And they reply,
so
no.
Straight question, how long do you think it's going to take? And how do you think it can stop? Because you mentioned something quite interesting, that it will be converted into a minimal conflict. So basically you're talking about containment, I think. Containment, and then what?
Well, I think it's a war that cannot be won by either side. Obviously, right. Russia cannot be left to win for obvious reasons, right? You don't want revisionism to emerge as a good policy, because the signals you send to any revisionist power is not the good ones.
AKA Turkey?
AKA Turkey, China, if you're in the South China Sea, and so on.
Very good.
On the other hand, it's not easy to defeat Russia. Let's not kid ourselves, right? So it's extremely difficult. So and how far can you push Russia before they react in a way that nobody wants? Or how far can you push Russia before other countries such as China join more actively, not militarily necessarily, but in terms of help? So the problem here is that it's a war that cannot be won by either side, and I'm not sure that the West wants a winner that will develop things in a way that can become unpredictable.
Right.
So this is another thing. What's the day after? And it's a similar situation we see in the Middle East now, right? What is the day after? So it's very easy. What's the post-Putin period going to be like? Right. So that's why I'm saying it's not containment in the Cold War sense, but it can be containment in the sense of impact.
The one who's keen on going into war are Poles with Russia. They're pushing a lot for this. That we have to continue. We have to push them back. We have to push them back, not only from Ukraine but further in. And I think this has to do with the Cold War. So again, I don't think that
they want a buffer.
They don't want a buffer. No. And I think what Russia is pushing is for a buffer zone. The three so-called independent oblasts that Putin called, I think that's the buffer zone for them. But I also believe that their initial target was Odessa.
Potentially, yes.
Ports.
Yeah, ports.
Connection
access to the
with
sea.
Moldova, and goes on and on and on. Transnistria has an issue.
Exactly. And there were many reasons, of course. It was also
exclusive economic zone with Turkey.
Absolutely, and it was also an estimate that it's going to be a relatively costless war. So there was a big enough incentive to do it because, say, why not? I'm going to get some sanctions, some slap on the wrist. That was the assumption. Of course, it was the wrong assumption. But at some point, both sides will have to accept new realities. And this is where inventive diplomacy must come in to find ways to make everybody happy and give both sides an exit strategy.
But what scares me the most is that if we start doing it in a diplomatic way and say, well, okay, this is a new reality, what stops any other country from invading another one and saying, well, that's your new reality? So I agree on the fine line that we have to designate some rules, at least on the diplomatic shift, at least on negotiation. And what I think in general terms is that we have not pointed out who's going to be the interlocutor of peace. The United Nations cannot really do too much. I mean, look what's happening in the Security Council in Russia, and about Russia, Ukraine, about Israel and Palestine, and goes on and on. But, that fine line, maybe it's about time that we renegotiate rules of international law, rules of engagement in diplomacy, as you correctly put, and so on and so forth. Let me take that equation, what you just created, and push it down into the Balkans. Lately, we've seen a lot of issues between Kosovo and Serbia for a lot of small reasons that have emerged to become very big reasons. Obviously, the main question has not been solved. But then again, we see that both sides are keen into jumping into an opportunity, probably without thinking that, everything on the border east of Europe from north to south is now becoming very troublesome. What do you have? What's your intake on the Balkans?
Well, I think this is where the EU has the chance to shine as much as possible because it's a relatively low intensity situation. Relatively, I'm not downgrading the importance,
Western
of
Balkans,
course, right?
Montenegro, Albania,
right?
Goes on.
And this is where it has also the capacity to utilize some power of attraction and some transformative power mechanisms and tools to help them find solutions through carrot and stick and other methods. And I think that nobody wants another hotspot at the end of Europe or at the beginning of Europe, depending where you stand. Right. So I think it's imperative for the EU to take a stronger step towards that direction, because like you very correctly pointed out, it's small things that they're elevating to bigger things, and because of grievances and internalized perceptions of enemies and friends and this and that, it's extremely easy to escalate. And in the era of disinformation that we live in, it's very, very easy to create problem when there's no reason to have such big problems. So we need to take strong preemptive measures to avoid another area of tension, because
Right.
I like the geographical way of looking at things. You start in north, you go down. It's the
further
Balkans,
north
right?
also. It's
Balkans. Then you go down now to the East Med, and then you go a little bit further, and you have now what's going on in Israel.
Yesterday we were having a podcast with Strategy International with one of our senior fellows, Kobe Michael, who's also at the INSS, and he was saying that with regards to what is happening with Hamas and Iran and all these countries and Hezbollah and Lebanon and so on, that some, especially from Iran, would consider that they would keep Israel busy. So it's a war of attrition. So is it an opportunity for attrition in the Balkans? I'm just wondering. I'm just taking some other equation and just putting it, because if you think about it, you're promised an EU integration, you're promised NATO integration. It's an opportunity for change, and it's also a great opportunity to complete conflicts and frozen conflicts, get further recognition. I mean, don't forget that Kosovo is not recognized from many states still yet, and it's a frozen conflict area. Do you think that, this is the emergence of keeping busy the European Union somehow? Because you said, I'm sorry, you said in the beginning that, this is the time to shine. So is this the shining, or is it keeping them busy?
Well, that's an interesting premise. I haven't thought about it, to be honest, like that. But if we reverse the argument, then I think these conflicts that emerge, they show to those potential conflict sides that it's not going to end well for your economy, for your people. If you rely on Russia, well, forget about it. It's too busy dealing with things. So here, if we're talking about forecasting, they have to forecast with whom do they want to be at some point in history. And we had to do it in Cyprus as well, right? It was a point of where we had to clearly choose our path. And I think for the Balkans, it's a similar situation. But you're right. I mean, the EU is stretched, it's busy, it's divided. It has immigration issues to consider. It has the Baltic states that are too close to Russia and have concerns, whereas others do not. You have the Southern European that they have other issues. So
we're coming into this.
So it is a busy period. I don't think that anybody's doing it on purpose to keep Europe busy, but they do keep Europe busy.
Having said that, I remember that Edi Rama was said by the Greek government that, if you want to keep a European path, you gotta sit down on table in negotiations and resolve these things the European way, and basically inherit values and ethics of the European Union, how business is done. Moving along, we start with Southeast Europe, not Southeast Europe and the Med. So then we'll go to the Med: Greece, Turkey, Cyprus. I know it becomes more complicated when your intake, the three parts. Then we add Britain as guarantor of powers, supposedly. The United States, France, the EU, the United Nations, and goes on and on and on, and then trilateral alliances. But before we go into this, the three ways: Greece, Turkey, Cyprus.
Well, a few days ago, I was asked to present the Cyprus problem to an international conference of psychologists, and they asked me to do it. And they said, you have 12 minutes. And I remember I started my presentation with a cartoon saying good luck, presenting the Cyprus problem. And now you pose a question that has the triangle that includes Greece and Turkey in it as well. I think this is the way we should look at this, in a triangle way. And I like the way you phrased it. Because we take it for granted that the Cyprus-Greece path is always parallel. And I don't think this is necessarily the case. So I'm not going to delve into the historical aspects of the Cyprus problem, right? So I think the question is, how can we have normalization of Greco-Turkish relations in the absence of progress on the Cyprus front? I think that's one interesting question that we should consider in this triangle. The second question would be, how far can Turkey push with coercive diplomacy on the Cyprus front without deteriorating their relationships with Greece?
When they use revisionist policy approaches.
When they use, exactly, like in Varosha, like in Pila, places like that. And the third is, what is at stake if Greece chooses kind of an abandoning approach, even though they will not, of course, ever say this.
Some professor initially mentioned that.
Right. I don't think
we should look at the bilateral and not the try issue.
Right.
Cyprus, but
they're not going to openly say it, right?
He openly said it.
Yeah.
He openly said it on international TV, but he was scrutinized, of course, because the root of the problem also lies in the bilateral relations of Greece and Turkey, but you cannot exclude the Cyprus issue for a lot of reasons, including also the Treaty of London, the agreement between the three parties.
You cannot exclude it, but in the lack of progress, what should be expected between Greece and Turkey? And at the same time, why not reverse it? what would be the positive impact if we have real good positive relations with Greece and Turkey on the Cyprus front. So it's a question of coupling and decoupling elements in this triangle, and I think this is the key area that is worth examining.
What about Cyprus as a sole entity, as a European country, as an independent country, has been since 1960? Can it play a pivotal role by itself into the resolution of the conflict, of the frozen conflict? It seems that the new president, for example, wants to have even further engagement of the European Union with a negotiator, for example. That means that Cyprus wants to be more engaged into the solution of the Cyprus issue, but we really don't know what the Turkish Cypriot community thinks, or the Turkish side of the government thinks. How is the standalone, for example, of Cyprus? Like, let's exclude now. I'm going southern. Let's exclude a bit Greece and Turkey, and then we will go with the alliances of Cyprus and.
Well, I think they're an integral part. We cannot be talking about a solution of the Cyprus problem without the Republic of Cyprus government. At the same time, we cannot exclude the Turkish Cypriots in this equation, right? We have to take them into consideration much more than we currently.
Because it is in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution. It's part of the issue that needs to be resolved. Now, you correctly noted that the current president wants more EU involvement, but at the same time, like you said, EU is busy. It's not sure how it can get involved. The
attrition in the Balkans, a bit Ukraine.
How it can get involved. We can barely convince the UN to send us a
new negotiator. But they were
individuals that would specialize on the Cyprus problem. So everybody's getting tired of this. And at the same time, you have Turkey that openly says, forget bizonal bicommunal federation. We want a two-state solution. And of course, you have the Turkish Cypriot leadership that simply echoes whatever the Turkish government says, which complicates things further because now they're talking a different language. At least before, they were talking about a bizonal bicommunal federation, but they disagreed on what exactly that was and how it would be resolved.
That is exactly what you said. And if we narrow it down to Pila, which basically they were claiming this is ours, this is yours. They never said this belongs to the Republic of Cyprus. But they actually said this belongs to us. And that us has to very much do with the Middle East and the way that they comprehend. We'll go into this as well. But do you think, in a short while, because we have the rest of the world to explore as well, but do you think that Cyprus can play a pivotal role, especially, and this is the intro, if you want, to the Middle East, the fact that Cyprus is really keen on playing search and rescue missions. It is in geographical proximity of a lot of events taking place in the South Gulf, in Africa, now in the Middle East. It played always a role, but now it's much more intensified, much more public, much more known that it plays a pivotal role. A lot of people are moving in and out of Cyprus whenever conflict is there.
Right. Well, you know what our politicians say. They always say that we lie in the intersection of three continents and we're the last pillar of stability before
borderline of Europe,
borderline of the Middle East and everything that is going
Crossroad.
on. There is, of course, truth in that. That said, we must recognize our size because you use the term pivotal role. So we can play a role. I'm not sure how pivotal that would be, right? Because the truth is we are a pillar of stability. We're not the biggest pillar in the world, but we are a pillar of stability. We are turning into a more strategic partner for major powers. We're not, the biggest strategic partner, but we are taken into consideration.
You're welcoming
We're welcoming warships. We finally took a clear stance on where we stand, which side we choose. At the same time, we've seen in the case of Lebanon, for instance, that we can be a place not only for search and rescue because our area of control is huge, but also in terms of welcoming people in need. We are a stopover place for soldiers that come from conflict areas until they go back. So all of these things help Cyprus become standalone, as you said, much more important than in the past. And I think this is an element that we have to take into consideration to maximize our impact and punch above our weight. And there is the chance to do that. This is not unreasonable, as long as we don't expect that we can play the role of, the mediator that will solve all the problems. We don't have that access, but we do have a good role to play in the area, and we have to be very careful not to engage in a way that will put at risk our own safety, because we have huge problems with the occupation of 37% of the island.
Yeah.
So we cannot ignore that factor as well.
Now, while you were talking, I was thinking about two elements that you just opened. The very short one, the latest one that you did, my expertise is on security and on NATO affairs. Actually, I'm on NATO Russia, so I was writing a lot about capabilities and capacity building in different pillars, including cyber, but you were actually talking about Cyprus, capabilities and capacities. And I think this is a very much food for thought, because if Cyprus designated itself into the future that it wants through a Euro-Atlantic future, then what you just said is capacity building, is a map of NATO. The map mean it's an abbreviation, basically saying membership action plan, because membership action plan starts with capacities and capability building both in the civilian and the military asset values, including also interoperability, NATO standard weapons, NATO standardization agreements, processes, and so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind, because that's really important. And at the same time, you spoke about opportunities where Israel, and I'm going a bit to the Middle East, Israel is a small country as well, which is surrounded by areas where actually security is among them the state apparatus that they live in on every single day, because they consider the area to be volatile, and it is. And somehow capacities and capabilities are built upon, but it shows lack of progress, presumably because it does not connect with NATO standards, meaning the Euro-Atlantic umbrella of security, the security provider you mentioned in the beginning. Before you go into this question, into these details, tell us how ineffective or effective is the current situation between Israel and things that are happening in Israel, especially because of the recent attack of Hamas, which actually destroyed, if you want, the myth for the third time. It's not the first time, but the myth of security, intelligence, and high-level security of Israel. How do you see Israel's reaction? What do you think will happen, especially to Hamas? And, what can it happen to the Palestinian people and to the authority? And then I'll go a bit in the Gulf, where I will end. And I will connect a few things with this.
Well, let's start with intelligence failure, which I think is a term that we'll be listening to for a long time to come, right? It was indeed an intelligence failure, and I think we're going to have to learn a lot about it. How come a state like Israel, that is known for its intelligence capabilities and technological capabilities, and I think part of the problem is what is called technology trap, which was essentially over-reliance on technology for its security, especially when it comes to the iron wall, to the fence by Gaza Strip, right? And with relatively easy means, non-high-tech attacks, they managed to blind the fence basically and do all the atrocities that Hamas carried out. So one aspect is that how.
So they cannot be called hybrid attacks.
They are hybrid attacks. They are hybrid attacks
because of their simplicity.
Well, because of the way they carried them out. So you had from anything from information to deception to literally kinetic attack using drones and
social media
media, of course,
in the works in the aftermath.
Exactly. So it was what I would not call it was just a terrorist attack. Obviously, it was an attack by a terrorist organization. Obviously, it was a terrorist attack.
It was above
that.
Not only because of the length or depth of the destruction, because of the atrocities and the way that they've done it.
Exactly. So it's a hybrid way of conducting warfare, obviously. And I think this is one element. How much emphasis should we put in technology? Because we know technology is what wins wars. And eventually, militarily speaking, there's no comparison between Israel and Hamas, of course, right? They none, zero. Yet they managed to kill over 1,200 people in a day, essentially. Just to put it in perspective, because some people don't understand the magnitude of this strike. In 9/11, where you had approximately 3,000 deaths in one day and was considered the biggest single-day terrorist attack, if you put it in terms of population, it would have been over 50,000 deaths in America in a single day. So you can imagine the impact it has this on Israel.
A lot of people say that that's the 9/11 of
Exactly.
Israel.
That's why we see this comparison, because it's also the intelligence failure aspect, but also the magnitude of the attack. Now, so the intelligence trap is one aspect. The other is the human intelligence aspect, and why did they ignore signals? Why didn't they pick it up? All of these things. And the third is what happens when there is chaos inside the country, how vulnerable you are. And I think this is a very important lesson for countries that are having external security threats on how they should treat their internal problems. So we all have a lot to learn. So what's going to happen? Well, it's a developing story, of course, but
we're pretty sure that the security architecture and the apparatus is going to change.
It will change. The question is not only what's going to happen in Gaza, because we can be almost certain that Gaza will not be the same. Well, it's not the same anyway now, but will not be the same once Israel is done with it. So I think the biggest question is, what's the day after? Who takes control of Gaza? Even if they manage to eliminate or cripple substantially Hamas, and they will, who's going to take over? The Palestinian authorities do not have the legitimization
since the elections of Mahmoud Abbas losing the Fatah versus Hamas.
Exactly. And generally, we know from opinion polls that were carried out in August of 2023 that they don't enjoy legitimization. So who's going to take over? Are we looking at Egypt and Jordan, perhaps, getting involved?
Right.
Are we looking at something like a Japanese model after World War II, where the Americans stayed there for a few years, reconstructing things and then passing it on to the Japanese? Are we looking at something like that? Are we looking at complete chaos or complete occupation of Gaza, whereby the military will be in full control? But this is too costly in terms of lives, money, and everything, right? Because you're going to be hearing deaths left and right constantly. So all of these questions, I think, are much more interesting and pressing beyond the tactical and military ones, because those, sooner or later, we'll see the number of deaths increasing, and Israel will win. The question, though, is the more you push in Gaza, the more difficulties the Arab states will have, the Gulf states will have, in maintaining a relatively neutral stance.
And that's where I'm going into my last questions before we reach into a conclusion. You said the Gulf states. We have a lot to say about Israel and Palestine and Cyprus.
Of course.
I want to keep it in that quartet, if you want. Cyprus, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Gulf in general, and Iran. I claimed in my own writings, in my articles at Strategy, publicly and also, that this fires against the possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. In between, whoever is in between, including also Cyprus, this means this creates a momentum and winner for trade agreements, including Jordan, Egypt, and so on and so forth. The Iranians knew about it. And that's why probably Hamas did what it did. What's your intake on the Gulf with Israel? And a very short, what's your intake about the Gulf and Cyprus and Greece and the trilateral, and also, if you want, Israel?
All right. Okay. First things first. That Iranian knew that any conflict would minimize the impact of the Abraham Accords is a given.
Right.
Now, Hamas was certainly calculating on that as well, and it was hoping that it will drag along both Hezbollah from Lebanon as well as potentially other states or at least entities from other states. So they counted on that. And the truth is, it has affected the relations between Israel and the Gulf states. But I think we haven't seen the limit of this impact. And the limit of this impact will depend largely to how Israel proceeds in Gaza. So if it goes in, which most likely it will as of the time of recording, it hasn't, but it's amassing troops right outside of Gaza, it will go in. And depending on the outcome of what happens there, I think we'll see the level of problems with the Gulf states. So I think that's that. Whether they will be completely destroyed remains to be seen, because Hamas was not a likable entity in the Gulf states. I was reading these opinion polls, and its reputation, the people who saw it positively was down to 17% or something like 13 to 17%. Very, very low percentages. But irrespective of how the political elite of those countries see Hamas, the population on the ground will want some form of support for the Palestinians. Maybe not Hamas directly, but for the Palestinians.
Humanitarian destruction.
Exactly. So this is a zero-sum situation, of course. So with the Palestinians, it means it's also anti-Israeli.
But can we have a two-state solution finally, you think?
I think it will require some serious zombie diplomacy to revive the possibility for a two-state solution.
Saudi Arabia can actually impact?
Potentially. I mean,
the UAE impact for that matter.
Potentially, it could. I mean, because this is where these states need to step up to be as honest brokers as possible. But they need to see how they're going to handle.
Because their level of progress in the latest years in the Gulf may be a showcase of how the Middle East can become.
Exactly. And I think this was also a concern for Hamas, that it was losing all the help it would get from the Gulf states because of the relative normalization between Israel and those states. It was going to lose all the support it had. So it had to stop that, reverse it, and of course the cost is gigantic, both for the Israelis as well as the Palestinians. Now, going back to the other part of the question, what does it mean for the rest of the region? Well, I think countries like Cyprus made it very clear with whom they stand at the societal level, but also at the political elite level. So I don't think the relations with Israel will be influenced in any way. If anything, it's the opposite that's going to happen, and not least because of Turkey's stance. Because Turkey has been...
Turkey's position. I avoided going on Turkey and Israel because now it's becoming really complicated, and I think it's going to be evident on the new security architecture of Israel that it will do without Turkey.
Exactly. And given Turkey's stance, then Israel, what is it going to look for? It's going to look at the countries that
for us,
provided.
it was agreed. It was agreed, and we both welcomed this, I think.
So it's very difficult to talk about opportunities in a time of crisis and tragedy, obviously, but if you look at it...
But it reshapes alliances and practices.
Exactly. So I think this is where things are shifting. Now, we do have emerging relations with the Gulf states, and I think we should try to maintain those. And this is where countries like Cyprus and Greece, for instance, can play a small role in acting as a bridge between opposing parties. Exactly. So I think there is room for countries like Cyprus, as long as we don't overestimate the actual abilities. Exactly.
Professor Constantinos Adamides, thank you very much for coming at our Prime Analysis.
It was my pleasure, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Best of luck with everything you do. It's fantastic.
Thank you very much, and we'll have you again together, and hope we can explore more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching another web series episode of Prime Analysis. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow our web series. My name is Dr. Marios Eftimiopoulos, and this is Prime Analysis. And remember, impact makes a difference.